Everybody. Hi, everybody. This is Mike Ingram, one of the co-leads of the working group. Here with my colleague Shamaruk Moyudin from Nathan Associates. Hey, Shamaruk.
Hi, Mike.
Hi. We're going to give just folks another minute or two to convene and then get into the conversation. I will be sharing a couple of slides here in a minute, and then also asking you to access a Web 2 tool called Mentimeter to crowdsource some information and ideas as we think about planning for next year. So you can access that either off of a mobile phone or off of a web browser. So if you could try to orient yourself so you can do that, that would be great. I think right now we're at about, it looks like at about 18 folks. So we'll give another minute or two. I see a couple of familiar names there, which is great. And we can get started here in a few minutes. I think we had up to about 30, 40 people originally RSVP'd. So see, it's perking up there. I see a few other folks joining here. All right, why don't we go ahead and jump in and we can, you know, we're hoping this is going to be a pretty collaborative conversation. We don't have so many people that we're not able to do that. I see there's a question in the chat. The software that I mentioned we'll use is Mentimeter at menti.com, but I'll share that link again in a specific account number here in a minute. So what we'd like to do today, so you're here as part of the Corporate Role and Development Workgroup for SID Washington. And what we'd like to do today is kind of three things. One, remind folks a little bit about the work group remit, what we are here for, how we're working collaboratively with SID Washington to drive content, to drive conversation around development and specifically around the role of corporate in development for SID. You know, talk about topics of interest as we get into planning for next year about the kind of events that you guys would like to see. Excuse me, sorry. And then also talk about other ways beyond maybe the standard events that might be interesting for those on the phone or others within the ecosystem to consider engagement around this topic. And so we have 90 minutes set for the conversation. If we don't happen to use all that time, you know, I'm all for giving time back as I think everybody's busy. But certainly we have this time slated to spend with you all today, so are happy to be here. So as I had mentioned, Shamaruk and I are your work group co-leads, and the remit for the work group and for each of the work groups is that, you know, we are trying to facilitate topical discussions around the topic of the corporate role and development, with the goal of getting 2 to 3 events per year scheduled and planned. And you know, we want to make sure that those are things not just that are interesting to Shamaruk and myself, but are things that are interesting to the broader community. And so rather than us sitting, you know, in a room by ourselves doing this, we really wanted to spend some time with a broader group of folks that focus on this topic to get, you know, a sense of what you may be interested in. Paul, Sherman from SID, any other thoughts as far as, you know, if I'm missing anything within the space of the remit? You know, obviously it's primarily around driving programming, but certainly if there are other things that other work groups are focused on that, you know, you think we could be thinking about, certainly open to any additional thoughts there.
No, I think we can wait until later on.
Okay.
And you mentioned the other work groups are planning if it becomes relevant.
Okay. So without further ado, then, the idea then is for us to spend this time really beginning to talk about topics around the space of the corporate role and development that are interesting for folks. As you can see, over the last year, or at least the last fiscal year, we ended up doing 2 events. Both were pretty close to each other in the spring. The first was one that I hope some of you were able to join, that Shamarouk facilitated, around transitional partnerships for gender equity. And then the second was one that I facilitated around learning around private sector partnerships. And so these were the 2 things that we had put together this year thus far. And right now, what we'd like to do is to take probably about 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes, for people to interact with the link that I have here below at menti.com. Use the code that is here to log in and start to put into this what will ultimately show up as a word cloud. And I'll switch to that view here in just a moment. But start to input some ideas that you might have as far as conversations, dialogue that you want to have around specific topics, be it corporate role with SDGs, the UN Global Compact, USAID's private sector engagement strategy, like what ESG investment. What are things that are interesting to you that you would like to begin to have a conversation about? And once we actually give, like I said, about 5 or 10 minutes, and you're able to put in as many ideas as you have, we'll start to have a bit of a discussion around that. So unless there are any questions here, I may pause and let folks get into that, and then we'll spend much of the rest of the time as a dialogue around some of the content that we see coming forth. Any questions? All right, I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to actually flip over to the word cloud so that people can actually see the content coming through real time. Can folks see my screen at this point?
Yes.
Awesome. Love it. I see some things here on CSR, corporate benchmarking, impact measurement, impact investment. When you got it wrong, I like that. Interesting. Analytics. And I know one of the challenges here, given kind of the diversity of language, we may not see kind of the repetition with the same frequency. So we'll have to think a little bit about some of the ideas that are percolating through. But please, keep thinking and keep adding things in here. The more content we have here, the more we'll kind of feed the conversation. I'm even logging on my phone as well, putting a few of my own thoughts in. We use this tool just given the, with 20 some people on the phone, really just making sure we're giving everybody an opportunity to kind of get their voice heard and seen, so that we're not trying to necessarily balance between 20 people talking concurrently. Looks like it's starting to slow down a little bit. Maybe I'll give, we're at 3:12, I'll give to 3:15, and then we can begin to get to a little bit of a conversation. And then certainly if there are questions or comments that people want to bring forward from the chat, certainly feel free to use that function as well. One question that I'm going to be interested in perspectives on, especially given kind of the diversity of members within SID, is the extent to which, when we're talking about the corporate role in development, you know, how much members of this group are interested in that specifically in a USAID context versus broader. I know that a lot of folks exist kind of in the implementer space, but I don't think we necessarily want to limit ourselves to just a USAID lens, but we'll be curious of people's perspective on that. Lots of interesting questions here. More than cash, responsible business conditions, job quality, impact CSR and measurement, certainly percolating to the top. We're at 3:13, we'll give it just another minute or two. All right, it is starting to slow down a little bit here. And so why don't we kind of pivot somewhat? Yeah, I see Shamaruk had suggested maybe doing, since we don't have such a large group, maybe we can just briefly do introductions. And what I'll try to do, just as I can maybe go straight down the list of the people that I see on here, maybe again, just to start with myself, Mike Ingram, a senior manager with Accenture Development Partnerships, spent a lot of time in the private sector engagement space. Maybe I'll pass it to Shamaruk just to briefly introduce yourself, and then we can go down the list.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shamaruk Mohidin, Principal Associate with Nathan. I work on private sector engagement as well as across a number of our Asia region projects.
I see Keith next on at least my list. Keith, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, Keith Dacco. I'm a senior private sector engagement advisor at USAID and also the private sector engagement secretariat lead. Thanks.
Fantastic. Welcome, Keith. I'm going to apologize if I mispronounce the name. Kandri?
Yeah, Gonja, Kandri. It's a bit difficult. I'm a project manager from Albania, but currently I'm working as a human rights investigator with the human rights program at the University of Minnesota. I've done a piece of work on corporate responsibility towards human rights in the MENA region. So welcome. I'm really interested to learn more.
Fantastic. Richard, I see you're next in my list.
Richard America. I'm spent a number of years at Georgetown University School of Business teaching in the MBA program, in particular a course that we called Investing in Africa. And now I consult and I'm doing some writing.
Fantastic.
Hopefully publishing.
It's always the goal, right?
That's the goal.
All right. Tom, I see you're next on my list. Solitario.
Sure. I don't know what happened to my video, so I'm incognito today. My world is strategy and corporate development. That's providing insight, if you will, and market risk analysis for corporate leadership to grow their company, to navigate the alternatives and to then identify opportunities. I'm pivoting into this world from the commercial space.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. Welcome. Max Markrich.
Hi, thanks, Mike. My name is Max. I work at a company called Stewart Red Queen. We advise DFIs, impact investors, and multinationals on impact measurement and sustainability in developing countries. I'm the head of our Washington, D.C. office here. This is my first time at a SID event, so I'm really glad to be included.
Fantastic. Welcome. Robert Hershey. I think you may be on mute. I'm having a hard time hearing. I'm not sure if others can.
I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, yes, now.
Okay. Fine. Anyhow, I'm a consultant and I do things especially in energy and environment, and I have led Department of Energy and USAID missions to various places and helped in development.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert. Welcome. I also see Ian Boldeston.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ian. I'm currently interning for SID-W, and I'm a student, undergraduate student at Tufts University. And I'm doing the notes in the summary for today's meeting.
Ah, very good. Let me see. I'm trying to scroll the rest of the way through. Cairo Lawrence.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kyra Lawrence, and I'm a program associate with SID Washington.
Nice to see you. And the name's running off here, but Parabi?
Rovi. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I lost my voice. I'm a program associate with SID-W, and I am an undergrad at UC Berkeley.
Fantastic. Good to see a lot of our friends from SID. Rob Thar.
Yeah, I'm Rob Thar with SIL International. It's an international linguistics organization that tries to find language solutions, and very interested in the CSR space.
Mark Schleifer.
Yeah, hi everyone. Mark Schleifer with CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise. We are we're an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're one of the core institutes of the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. We're all about private sector engagement and in development. So very interesting conversation for us.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. Paul Gwinnett.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I spent a career with DAI and Deloitte and ACD-Avoca managing principally economic development, food and agriculture programs, food security, and it was always my mandate to incorporate private sector to realize that that dynamism and that synergy. Glad to join.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining, Paul. Todd Mullenkamp.
Hi, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Mullenkamp, and I work in the Private Sector Engagement Hub at USAID that sits within the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation. And at USAID, we kind of are the hub in DDI, kind of coordinating a lot of private sector engagement work across the agency. And then, as Keith noted, within our different bureaus, technical bureaus, there's a lot of folks that work on private sector engagement as well. Nice to meet you all.
Fantastic. Steve Malick.
Steve, you're on mute.
I am muted. Yeah, thanks so much. Sorry about the delay. My name is Steve Malick. I'm actually a geophysicist by professional background, having worked in the oil and gas industry for quite a number of years, but really shifted my attention in recent years to working with nonprofit organizations in Eastern and Southern Africa, and pretty much focused on exploration for water, groundwater exploration and drilling, and then tie in with solar and agricultural development in market access for smallholder farmers in Southern Africa. So very much interested in the partnerships that could develop with various corporations, including the energy sector, in working with local organizations or local farmers in Southern Africa, more so, I suppose, with the food and beverage sector as well, but very much on water and energy development and market access. Thanks.
Thanks for joining, Steve. Donna Sloan.
Hello, my name is Donna Sloan. I'm from the University of Arizona. I'm a research administrator. I was invited to the SID events from our new Vice President for Global Operations, and our institution is doing a lot more in research globally. And so they wanted me specifically to find out more information from the SID group on how, the corporate role sort of is involved with all of that. We do interdisciplinary research on energy, water, agriculture, a variety of things. So that's why I'm here.
Fantastic. Welcome, Donna. And at least last on my list is Parna, Aurora.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aparna. I'm a recent MPA graduate in Gender and Public Policy and Economic and Political Development. I worked in India for 8 years. I worked with social enterprises at an incubator, hand-holding enterprises who worked in skill development, agro-processing, waste management spaces in India. Really excited to be here and learning more about the work done by the working group. Thank you.
Fantastic. And have I missed anyone? Jamal, maybe?
Hey everyone, I'm Jamal. I'm the Events and Administration Coordinator at SID.
Welcome, Jamal. Thanks. Anybody else that we missed? Good. Well, it's like I said, it's always kind of interesting to see the diverse group that we pull together at SID events, especially when we're starting to talk about the corporate role in development. But what I'd like to do is just really start to have kind of a little bit of a discussion about some of the topics that have kind of percolated here to the top. I think that, at least here in the center, the things that popped up largest around corporate social responsibility, ESG or ESG investing, impact and measurement seem to at least have gotten a few hits, even though I think sometimes that can get blurred a little bit with the way that word clouds get put together. But I'd like to just open it up, and if folks want to maybe either raise their hand or come off mute and maybe just give a thought or two about some of the things that resonate here or compelling, and maybe even to drill down a little bit more about specific interests that you'd like to see explored with respect to events in this topic or dialogue that you think needs to happen.
Well, somebody's got to start. So I'll start, even though I'm probably the most ignorant one in the group here when it comes to ESG investing. My perspective there is along the lines of this is the current hype around or current focus or interest around investors on a large scale that is looking at what it is we can do when it comes to environmental, social, and government type, because it's central to the way of thinking, and it seems to be a crossroads between development and the corporation. So that's why I think this is relevant and why I think it might be a topic to further explore as part of the work group.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, it's interesting, just to add a little bit of perspective on this. And this came out actually in some work that I had done recently for one of my clients is, especially when development types, be it NGOs, donors, et cetera, are starting to think about the corporate role in development. I think ESG ends up being so critical as one element of the way that businesses are increasingly reacting to their direct stakeholders. And so through the ESG lens, they're reacting to the expectations of investors and how their investors' expectations are changing with respect to their behavior. But I think it's not just investor expectations that are changing, but customer expectations and employee expectations and even government expectations. And I think that what we're seeing at some level is an increasing alignment of values with interests, and that the changing values of the direct stakeholders of these business are forcing kind of a behavioral change that maybe in the past would have been more rhetorical. And I think that's really interesting. And there's a lot from my perspective that I feel like we're starting to be almost at a tipping point in the way that corporates are thinking differently about the way that they're trying to influence the impact side beyond just like a profitability side. But certainly I think the ESG space is a really interesting and ripe one for more conversation.
I could just chime in here.
Yeah.
Tom, I think Mike, you guys are both right. I work with a lot of impact investors and multinationals, and one of the things they ask is actually, what's the difference? Sometimes they're starting at a place where they know they need to get involved in ESG and impact, but don't really know where or how to get going. And the distinction that we'll make for our clients is, ESG is making sure you do no harm, and impact is then making sure you do good. And then how do you incorporate these things into your operations in a pragmatic manner that's relevant for you? Because if you're a investor wanting to go into construction, there are different ESG considerations than if you go into, agri-processing, right? Because there are different environmental, social, and governance concerns. And with respect to impact, it's then a different question. What do you want to achieve ultimately? And how do you get there? And I personally think it would be really interesting to have an event talking about these topics, and you can have it as entry level or as advanced as you need, depending on the audience you want to attract. So that would be my 2 cents on it.
Oh, that's helpful. I see, Todd, I see you put a comment in here as well on the evidence. Do you want to maybe say a few things on that? Then I see also Richard also made a comment, so give him the opportunity as well, but maybe Todd first.
Yeah, of course, kind of an extension. And I'm inherently biased because I work on the evidence and learning team in the private sector engagement hub. But I think that a lot of the conversation on ESG still sounds like very overly optimistic to a lot of folks. And so I think there was a really great McKinsey study that was done not too long ago that kind of examined the different elements of evidence that exist for promoting top line growth, bottom line growth, and reducing long-term risk factors in ESG investments. And so I think that's something that kind of tried to tie ESG investments with like financial success and broader growth opportunities would be really interesting from our side.
Fantastic. And if you actually have a link to the article, if it's easy enough, dropping in the chat, I'm sure others would be interested as well. Richard, I saw you had a comment on some work you're doing in the Congo. I don't know if that's directly related to this or more just informative, but if you'd like to make a comment here.
Yeah, it is. It's in the area in the far south around the cobalt mines. And cobalt is a key ingredient in batteries of all kinds. And we're moving towards electric cars. So it's going to be, although there might be substitutes for cobalt, for quite a while, it'll still be crucial. So that means that Ford and General Motors, the computer companies, and other Silicon Valley companies have an interest in cleaning up the lives of tens of thousands of women and children in particular in that region around the cobalt and the copper mines. And we're working hopefully with those large multinationals who have organized themselves in the Responsible Minerals Initiative to try to advance that cause. And what we're doing is just a small piece of that. But it might be a topic of broader interest for SID to have a discussion of the Responsible Minerals Initiative and other similar extractive industry initiatives to address those problems. They're long-standing problems, as you know. Some years ago, as a footnote, I was the chair of the SID Africa work group, and that was 15 or more years ago. I did that for 3 or 4 years, and we had a series of events, obviously focused on Africa, but quite a bit of it involved the private sector.
Fantastic. Certainly, I think the Responsible Minerals Initiative is an interesting topic. And I think, at some level, and I think there are different ways we could think about coordinating something like that, but, either something that is a deep dive on the mineral extractive industry, or even like a crosswalk of different sorts of initiatives that are trying to protect against kind of the risk associated with some of the private sector engagement. And you could certainly imagine that across agriculture and other spaces as well. But I think that's certainly an interesting idea, especially as there's more private sector activity in some of these emerging markets. Other questions or other thoughts on the ESG space, or if not, certainly would welcome people's comment on maybe some of the other bigger topics of CSR impact or measurement. At least for those who maybe put these topics in, what interests you about these? Where do you see topics ripe for conversation?
If I can jump in one more time.
Please.
I've done a lot of work with business schools in Africa. It's my passion. I've probably visited 40 universities and their management or business schools, and their entrepreneurship centers, which are evolving probably in 25 countries. And I've come to believe that strong business schools are one of the keys to everything. Future progress in every sector, in every country. So an event might invite some, and it could be a Zoom event, management education experts from Africa and their counterparts here in the States to have an interesting discussion about how to improve the quality of management broadly, public sector and private sector, by strengthening business schools. There's an organization here in Washington called the Global Business School Initiative. I'm on the advisory board, and it includes business schools from all over the world, including many of the leading US business schools. But the main regional focus for the next few years is Africa, and trying to lift the quality of business schools across the continent. Obviously, there's some very good ones in South Africa, at Wits and Cape Town and Stellenbosch, and Lagos Business School, and a couple in Kenya. But there needs to be a lot more work. And the private sector, the corporate sector, would have, I think, an interest in seeing that happen.
No, that's certainly an interesting topic, and I mean, at some level, and having worked for a few companies that operate across sub-Saharan Africa, I think one of the things that becomes really interesting is the war for talent, and kind of almost the inflation that happens for wages at kind of the top end, but they tend to be cannibalizing just each other with just hiring and trying to hire away talent from one another versus, at the lower levels, really the reinvestment and building the pipeline so you actually have a broader base to operate from. Yep. And it's an interesting.
Yeah, we were fortunate some years ago to get a grant from the Kellogg Foundation, and we, excuse me, we created a network of all the business schools in the SADC region. And we had workshops in Johannesburg every year for their deans on how to improve everything about the school, the curriculum, the faculty, the facilities, and so forth. And if I might be so bold, I would suggest to our USAID friends online here that USAID might carve out a new special project on strong business schools in Africa. Take that and run with it, please.
Keith and Todd, that's to you. So
yeah.
So I'm curious for the folks who maybe had highlighted CSR as a topic. I'm curious your perspective there. Certainly it's a topic that comes up a lot, but certainly one that always kind of interests a number of people. Are there certain topics for the CSR folks among us that would like to add something? Mark, I see your hands up.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm using the old hand raising thing. I know other people are just jumping in. No, look, I mean, I really appreciate that question, and I think that there are some things that that SID could do around that within this group of particular interest that speak to the organization's potential to be a bridge between the development sector and implementing NGOs and the donor community, and not just NGOs, but development for-profits as well, the implementing community writ large, and the corporate sector. Because I think one of the things that's coming out of this conversation, and of course there are specialized consultancies that help companies navigate this landscape, but terminology like CSR, impact investment, ESG, it gets thrown out a lot. I think a lot of us have a sense of what the differences among these things are, but I think a lot of companies don't necessarily know. They're under pressure to do something good for society, and then you've got for and not-for-profit implementers that want to tap into corporate money, and they want to figure out a way to partner with corporates and cobble together a public-private partnership, and maybe approach USAID to do matching funding. But there's a disconnect, I think, sometimes in between the development community. We hear CSR and we think, oh, we're going to get our hands on corporate dollars. Corporations aren't necessarily thinking about that. They might be thinking about, sharing expertise and time and talent and information. There's sometimes a mismatch, I think, among implementing, I especially notice this among NGOs. They think, you just have to track down a company's CSR department and they'll give you money to do what you're already doing. And that's not what companies think. They think, here are our priorities in the country where we have a mining operation or a construction operation. We're looking for, implementers that can help us meet those priorities. So I think, this group in particular within a structure like SID-W could really, play some sort of a translating or a gluing together kind of role to help those partnerships form, so that development implementers, know what companies are looking for, and companies know what our capabilities are to help them meet their CSR goals.
Just to chime in on that, and I certainly appreciate the thought. This idea of almost, the corporate role or private sector engagement, especially when maybe coming from the INGO side, starting from a perspective of dollars, is one that I'm really interested in, because I think it's honestly, it's probably almost the worst place to start in some ways as a conversation, thinking about revenue or thinking about like new money coming through the front door. But I think it's just kind of an incentive thing where, when you're in an INGO space, that tends to be something that's front of mind. And I know, and this is certainly a conversation, Todd, you and I have had previously, is it's also something that USAID, I think, struggles with sometimes as well. I think sometimes there's a threshold of a dollar involvement, to make something interesting or viable or worth the investment, et cetera. But that ultimately a lot of very potentially impactful partnerships can be based on things that have nothing to do with cash. Could be value, could be assets and some other kinds of non-cash assets. It could be intellectual property. It could be employee volunteerism. It could be, other things that don't start with cash but bring value. And I think that thinking about that is interesting. And then, Mark, I think the other thing that you kind of touched on, which is almost kind of a, almost starts to be kind of like the 101 of engaging with corporates, is like, understanding that just starting with the CSR side is not the only route into a conversation with businesses. Sometimes the CSR group or the foundation, like a philanthropic foundation, is a viable path in, but is it the viable path to the most sustainable, scalable impact? Usually, maybe not, because it may not align directly with kind of long-term growth. And so I think that element of translation is certainly an interesting one. But those are just some of my thoughts. Certainly would value other folks' opinions or Mark, a reaction.
Yeah, Mike, yeah, I tend to agree. And, I do see, it depends, at the agency of where you're at. But, we started off way back, with the original GDA mechanism, and that's evolved quite a bit. So, I mean, and we have a lot of different ways now where we engage, in many of which you just mentioned. And I think it is important that we continue to look at those where there is and aren't availability. Sorry, I have in the background.
Quite all right.
But yeah, but there are other areas where we have to look strategically as where catalytic capital can be utilized, and we can make the most headway. And that's where we're kind of analyzing where money can be best spent. It is one thing to leverage funding, but we're trying to see where that funding can be best utilized, for the limited amounts. But there are numerous ways that we do engage with corporates, and I think all of which are viable depending on the situation on the ground. So yeah.
A question that I'd be interested folks' reaction to, and this in some ways related back to the idea of cash or dollar or contribution, but is almost not thinking of kind of the corporate role in engagement and kind of a transactional lens as we're going to put together a partnership, but thinking of it more as kind of almost a longer term relationship level, whether it be between an NGO and a corporate, or the donor and the corporate, or a business association and a corporate, and trying to think about almost more, how do you evolve a relationship over time? Because I think what tends to happen is, at some level, there needs to be some degree of getting to know you and an appreciation of the incentives that are operating on both sides before you can ultimately develop something small into something that is larger and almost grow together in some sort of a collaboration. And I'm curious folks' thoughts on that, because I think at some level, I feel like too often within this space, there is a leap to wanting to do the big things, the splashier things, and there are incentives that want us to focus on large contributions, the biggest programs. But ultimately, the biggest programs usually start from what are ultimately smaller relationships, smaller investments, in how we think about actually the incentives that allow us, to explore those maybe smaller collaborations. Any thoughts?
Add something prior to comments on your question. I would ask, how can we start relationships with corporates who are not part of this engagement, CSR or other engagements in development? Because we talk about corporates who are based maybe in the Western world and have a better understanding, and they know about development issues and CSR principles through the teams they have. But if we talk about corporations in the developing world, I can name you thousands of corporates who don't even have a team that deals with issues of CSR, or they don't consult anybody, no team, when they do their investments, and there is no value interest discussion there. So one of my questions or challenges is like, how can we reach out and invite these corporates? I'm from Albania. I know 3 or 4 corporates there that are making millions in mining or other businesses. And honestly, they have done nothing, or I don't know anybody who works on CSR. They don't have any person or anybody who is doing investments that deal with human rights issues or investing based on all these principles and standards that internationally or nationally we have in our work.
But that, if I could just jump in, I mean, that's such a good point that you raised there. So, as I mentioned, SIPE is affiliated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. One of the things that we've learned is that function that, it could be called sustainability, it could be called, CSR, it could, the different companies give that function a different name, and then it sits in different places. It sometimes sits in a communications, external relations shop. But sometimes they have a foundation separately. Sometimes it sits in HR. Sometimes it's in compliance. Sometimes it's in government relations. It sits in different places, and it can also be very small. I mean, the dedicated CSR team might be tiny, but there might be a lot of people sitting in the compliance shop who are thinking about environmental and labor issues. So, that is, and I would say the smaller the implementing organization, the harder it is to find the right people. And then on top of that, you throw in, well, if you're looking at doing something in Ghana, should you be talking to HQ in Houston or DC or New York, or should you be talking to the country office? So understanding how corporations make decisions about their engagement with development implementers is also extremely complicated, because there is no one size fits all kind of approach in the companies.
I think that's a good point, Mark. And I mean, just even to add on to that, and I would suggest for folks interested looking at USAID's Enduring Results Study 3.0 that the previous event was held around. But one of the nuances that was found in the study was the difference between success pathways for local private sector organizations versus global private sector organizations. And that, if I remember correctly, and Todd, you can probably correct me if I'm off base here, is that in the local contexts, market-driven solutions were really critical. That because, and I think some of that is because you're probably talking about larger entities that may not have a CSR arm, don't necessarily have foundation dollars to invest in a grant, but if a partnership or a collaboration could start from a premise of shared interests where there is a business imperative, then it was more likely to see kind of an uptake. And so that may be another consideration, Ganjo, when we're thinking about kind of smaller local private sector or corporate engagement versus global multinational corporate engagement.
I'll use the hand up approach.
Please, yes.
So, so I mean, I don't think it's a big secret, but the concept of public-private partnerships and business is a natural fit. Both parties gain benefits and improve their effective communities. So I think that it's highly relevant with regards to what we're talking about here, and central to the future of where I mean, USAID guys can comment, where I think they would like things to move. If we can have more private, I think it's a continual effort on behalf of the government to get more private involvement, so that the folks in Albania, the companies in Albania and other countries, and not to pick on Albanians, are more engaged. I'm also interested in this graphic, though, about the concept around measurement, because there's a lot of talk about these things, and whether it be ESG or CSR. And then I think will be super interesting would be to see, okay, so how do we actually measure that? And so I think that would be also another very valuable topic for the working group to take on, because all these initiatives without measurement are too often, as you've seen in the past with other development efforts, initiatives, they fall to the side.
So clearly, impact and measurement, I think both are certainly related and are percolating to the top here. You know, I guess one question, and not to take us down a rabbit hole, but I think, you know, impact and measurement's a pretty big space that we could probably, you know, delve into. And so I'm curious, are there specific elements of impact and measurement that are maybe most top of mind? I'll give one comment here and then certainly open it up for others is, and this is premised on a colleague of mine's, some thought leadership that he did. But one of the things that he was seeing is that a lot of corporates orient their impact measurement around the SDGs, in the sense that it's an understood framework, it's a very public framework. A lot of corporates are signatories to the UN Global Compact, and so, you know, committing to some contribution to the SDGs makes sense to them. But within the INGO space, especially INGOs that maybe, you know, are implementers, et cetera, you know, a lot of their measurement tends to be oriented to a specific project goal, which makes sense, but maybe is not translated back to the SDGs. And so when you get into conversations around collaboration between corporates who use one language around measurement and NGOs or development practitioners who sometimes use the same, but maybe not always use the same, that sometimes there's a disconnect. And so that's maybe a lens that, you know, we could explore, but I would certainly, you know, welcome other comments or thoughts on impact measurement.
Yeah, I mean, you know, brief finding, I've been working a lot with some benchmarking and potential with external benchmarks such as the WBA and others. And talking to corporates, it's been interesting because a lot of them seem to, the ones that are particularly forward thinking, have already put a lot of time and effort into developing their own internal metrics of how they're doing that. So I would challenge that thought. They do develop around the SDGs, but the thought of, at least in some of the conversations that we've had, of using or, you know, being measured by an external sort of benchmark or measurement system, indicators are a little bit, are not as well received because they've already done this and put a lot of into customizing it, and they feel that it's not getting to the impact, it's just kind of ticking some boxes. So just some food for thought to think about. Not everyone believes that, but there are several large multinationals that have put a lot of time and effort into this for their internal purposes that may not be as widely accessible.
Well, thanks for that, Keith.
I could chime in.
Please.
Mike, I think you make a really good point that the way that different types of organizations approach impact measurement, be it an NGO or corporate, they do it very differently, right? Because they ultimately have different stakeholders. NGOs are probably reacting to a framework that comes down from their grant provider, like an FCDO or Bill and Melinda Gates, whereas the corporate come from what can we use this for in terms of engagement with consumers, with policymakers, with investors. The question, I think, with respect to the event at hand is, who would the audience be for this event? Excuse me, I've got some sirens outside, right? So being that this is about the corporate role, is the audience here probably going to be people from NGO looking at public-private partnerships that want to engage and bring in the private sector? Is it people from the private sector specifically who want to learn more? And we can provide pragmatic ways to do so. I think that would be something worth discussing and thinking about, before being really specific in terms of what topic within impact measurement, because exactly as you say, it is so broad, it could mean so many things.
No, I think that's a great point, Max, and I think it's an important one for us to think about with respect to audience and interest. Is what's the voice that people want to hear talking about these topics? And I think that's one of the things, and I'm going to say something and I'm curious people's reaction to it, is I think even though, you know, we strive for diversity within SID Washington, I think our member base is largely represented by implementers, INGOs, consultancies working in the development space. Even though increasingly there are corporate members of SID, and I know that there is increasingly an interest to try to continue to build that body, there are fewer of those voices typically within the membership. And so I think at least, and Shamrook, I'm curious of your perspective on this. I think that at least in some of the panels we've had, having more corporate voices on the panel has usually been, I think, well received, making sure that voice is present. But in the same sense, I think it's also around structuring the conversation in a way such that we're exploring kind of you know, topics that are also so interesting to the user base or the member base, so to speak.
Yeah, I think we've tried to have corporate voices like the ones that we've done recently, you know, and the ones that I've facilitated in the last couple of years. We had two companies, PepsiCo, MasterCard, and then UPS and Gap Inc. So we have been getting corporate voices on the panel. It's challenging sometimes to have these events respond to all of the different needs that the group has, but you know, what we're trying to do is really kind of bring to the top what some of the key themes are that everyone's dealing with, or most people are dealing with. So impact measurement definitely comes up quite a bit. How do you make the business case comes up quite a bit. So these are things that we try to weave into the dialogue, no matter what the event focuses on. So we can continue to do that. But I think that one other takeaway for me so far has been, how do you engage the local private sector? And this has come up quite a bit with, you know, both NGOs as well as USAID partner implementers and others. So I think that that's something that we can think more deeply about and figure out how do you actually energize and motivate private sector in developing countries, right? Because a lot of the times you can't make the business case in the same way that you can in the developed world. And I know that Mark, you know, you and SID have been doing some work with local chambers. So I think even having some voices from local chambers of commerce in other countries might be a good way to sort of open up that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, because obviously, you know, local companies have their own interest in engaging with, you know, multinationals as well, but that often has more to do with things around supply chains and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, a lot of these different threads definitely they come together.
I like that around the local. I think too often we maybe forget about local because there's always the desire for the big splashy global brand, but I think the impact of locally driven can be super impactful as well. I know we're at 4 o'clock here, and we were going to spend another 15 minutes on this. I'm curious if there are any other topics that folks see, and I'm just kind of moving aside the pictures, at least on mine, to take a look at. Even though they maybe didn't flow to the center and have multiple hits, any specific other topics that are percolating here that catch your attention that maybe we haven't touched upon yet? Certainly, I think a lot to digest and a lot of interest here for Shamrook and I to explore, and certainly would welcome, you know, others' thoughts.
This is Steve Malick once again. As I mentioned in my intro, I came from the oil and gas industry, and just returning a bit to this topic of CSR and picking up on a few keywords that you mentioned, Mike, and then Mark did earlier, such as know what you're looking for, value, alignment, relationship, shared interests, collaboration, all those words. And, you know, my observation working in the oil and gas industry with this area of corporate social responsibility or obligation is that many times it is just that. We've got, you know, a production sharing contract, and you are obligated by the contract to do certain social programs, and it's really just a matter of fulfilling that without a lot of what you'd call shared value. It's just a matter of fulfilling the obligation. And so what I'm kind of very much shifting toward is this whole idea. What I like very much is creating shared value that Porter and Kramer published in HBR in 2011, this whole notion of what's in it for them. And something I've noticed, you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, the oil and gas industry is actually including national oil companies, have really addressed this in a way. There's an industry organization that's talked about or published what they call a mapping of the oil and gas industry to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this whole idea of shared value, it's a little bit tough on some of in the oil and gas industry and the extractive industries that was mentioned earlier, the mining industry, as opposed to food and beverage, where sourcing locally grown produce and so forth, it's just lends itself more readily. But one thing, in terms of shared value, I don't know, I'm just kind of talking about how that particular industry can create what's in it for them, basically, is the question. I remember in one production sharing contract that we had in South America, we were training welders. And so there was clearly a benefit of having local students that could become competent welders for our construction projects, that type of thing. And I guess I'll just end my comment by saying there's a difference between CSR and this whole idea of CSV, or creating shared value. And I think that's a more significant driver for corporate interest in development.
I certainly think the topic of shared value is one that repeatedly is coming up of late. And I think one of the things that's a big challenge, and maybe this is something that we can explore, maybe more of a challenge for some organizations versus others, is truly understanding how to effectively have a conversation about shared value. And for two different kinds of organizations to come together to have that conversation. Because I think oftentimes the private sector and, whether it's INGOs or development implementers or other development actors, can often have a very difficult time understanding one another and what the incentives are for each of their separate organizations, and so there could be something. I'm sure there are folks on this phone who maybe have had, who may even have tools or methods around this, but is even methods that are specific to identifying shared value opportunities between a set of actors, and to better understand and diagnose how those things come into alignment. Because I think, that's one of the reasons that, the extent of the relationships tends to matter, is because with a longer term relationship, you usually have a better understanding of some of those underlying incentives and objectives, et cetera. But would welcome if others have comments or thoughts around the topic of shared value, or shared value as a topic for events, et cetera.
Maybe one way to address this is we can also think about some really good shared value case studies, because there are companies that have a very compelling case for why they're doing certain social projects, because they're mitigating risks in a certain way, or increasing employee productivity, or reducing costs. So there are specific business reasons why certain companies are engaged in their CSR work, or even through some of their sourcing work. It doesn't always have to be sort of within the CSR department, but they're sourcing a certain way because it's environmentally or socially responsible, but also has a business value. So if it's helpful, we can maybe kind of take a case study approach and bring some of those examples through some of these events, because I know that for each case or each company or each sector is so different. For oil and gas is very different from than for agriculture. So I think we can definitely keep that in mind in terms of presenting case studies of really strong shared value cases, which are very different from sometimes how corporate foundations act, right? So sometimes there's a much stronger business case and reduction of costs associated with that type of work. So that's something that we can think about if that's helpful for the group.
No, I think that's helpful.
Just to add to that, I'm quite new to this SID-W, but are there any case studies or any of those examples that you just spoke of available?
They are available. I mean, if you look at, for example, Mars's case study, their cocoa sustainability case study, the reason why they're investing in women or investing in sustainable agriculture in Africa is because it's improving the quality of their cocoa beans and improving the quality of their products. So there's a direct sort of monetary value to, kind of in making that sort of investment, right? Or the reason why Coca-Cola is investing in small businesses in Africa is because of their increasing their distribution. So that's reducing their transportation costs. So I think some of those are compelling. And then same thing with a lot of the IT companies that are connecting, last mile customers. They're investing in infrastructure, in IT infrastructure, but it's also helping them gain more customers. Same with financial services, they're obviously interested in customer acquisition and doing a lot of training of small businesses and so on. So I think there are a lot of really good, sort of examples there in those sectors. I think definitely in the environmental space, there's a lot, there's a lot of companies shifting to better sources of energy because it's resulting in cost savings, right? So I think that when talking to companies, obviously making those cases is stronger than saying that we just want to have a partnership with the company, coming from an NGO perspective. And I think that having really good examples and case studies probably helps, whether it's government, aid, representatives or NGOs that are trying to engage companies to sort of talk the corporate language and try to make the case in the right way.
Thank you.
I see we're starting to lose some folks here, as we cross over the 4 o'clock hour. Maybe what I can do is, if I can briefly stop sharing here, and then I can kind of, go back to the original slides. Just to kind of the last question that we had, which was around other ways to engage. And so, as I had mentioned at the beginning, our remit primarily as the co-leads of the work group are to help plan and organize the programming around this topic, which, we typically do, like I said, several events per year. Not that there's a cap on them, but there is some degree of a capacity that we have to work with SID to make sure that we don't do more than they have the capacity to do, as well as that Shamrook and I have the capacity to organize, but certainly can leverage some of the folks on this phone to the extent that it's helpful. But we're curious if there are other mechanisms through which you would be interested in exploring engagement. And the one thing that, I highlight here, and this was, I think, mentioned in one of the most recent SID newsletters, is that they are piloting a LinkedIn group for one of the other work groups as a mechanism to facilitate some degree of engagement and networking outside of the event structure, outside of the SID network structure. And I'm curious to the extent that folks on this phone or on this call might find something like that valuable, or if there are other ideas that folks have that we could bring back to SID as things that they could consider and explore as we look towards next year. So maybe I'll stop there, see if there are thoughts.
I think that should we share our ideas now?
Please.
I think that the LinkedIn group pilot, it's a great idea, actually. I think more of us every day are engaged with LinkedIn as a professional environment of engagement for different issues. So I will be down for it. Another thing I wanted to ask, Mike, do you guys, I don't know a lot, so that's why I'm asking, do you guys have regional offices in other parts of the world?
Maybe I can defer to Paul to talk about kind of the presence more globally. I'm primarily familiar with SID Washington. Paul, I don't know if there are chapters elsewhere.
Okay, thanks.
If Paul Sherman is still with us.
Sorry, my audio completely cut out. I missed the
Paul, the question had been if there are chapters, SID chapters outside of the Washington area. I wasn't familiar with the other network hubs.
Yeah, right. So there are, but I don't know what it looks like right now because I don't think the last year and a half was too kind to the other SID chapters because of COVID. So I'm not sure. And not all SID chapters operate the same way that the Washington chapter does, that we do here in DC. Some operate more as, thought leadership hubs. Others do a little more advocacy work. So not all of them are exactly the same, and will all have this kind of similar operation set up. So this might be more unique to the Washington chapter.
Okay, thank you. Max, I see your hands up.
Yeah, thanks. I think a LinkedIn group here makes a lot of sense. It seems like low-hanging fruit, in my opinion. One additional thought would be, I don't know if the group or SID-W have a blog, but as a small organization, committing resources to marketing and content creation is sometimes a kind of a barrier to doing so. But seeing that there were, the level of engagement here, 20 people, and that there are other groups as well within the SID-W community, maybe there could be some engagement across groups to make a schedule of blog posts and then plan that out for a serious amount of time, and people volunteer or commit to doing some blog posts, and we can leverage the scale that the network has if we're talking about planning throughout the year. So that would just be a thought to share.
No, I think that's certainly something that's interesting, and we can certainly explore that with Paul and the others within SID to see how we might do something like that.
So I'll just say right now I don't think that's going to be really possible anytime in the near future, just because, for clarification, for those of you who are not very familiar with SID-W or this is your first event, we're a really small team. We only have 6 full-time staff, including myself. So it's hard. It's just a lot of energy that we have to put into it, and we're trying to focus on many other projects right now around improving what we currently produce. Not shooting down the idea in the long term, but just right now, I just don't think it's going to be possible for the foreseeable future.
When I think another way, ultimately, that something like that could potentially be facilitated through, if the LinkedIn pilot kind of moves forward, is that ultimately people can individually blog on LinkedIn and share through a LinkedIn group. And so then ultimately you have kind of a shared conversation structure with like interested individuals. That's not necessarily something that has to be managed by SID themselves. So that may also be another way to get to the same outcome.
Right. The thing that the issue still stands is that SID staff will still need to vet whatever is created. So that there still need to be a vetting process one way or another, regardless of how it's done.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
I see Ian put a comment of what if members of the different work groups could sign up to write the blogs. So sounds like that maybe is the same constraint, but other
Yeah,
thoughts
similar.
or
Sorry.
go ahead, Paul.
No, I'm just saying it's, yeah, you're right. It's the same constraint.
And I see a Parna's comment about continuing to explore the fostering gender equity, you know, as a cross-cutting issue. I think certainly is something we can look at. Obviously, that's something that we just had an event on or a related event on, but certainly something that we don't want to lose sight of that as a cross-cutting issue. Paul, I guess one last question maybe from me to you is, in this kind of revisiting what I had said at the outset, is are there specific other activities or other engagement mechanisms that other work groups are exploring outside of the events, as well as LinkedIn groups? I don't know if there are other, and granted, in the COVID world, post-COVID world, we're kind of still trying to understand what it means to kind of, you know, interact with one another, but maybe even in recent past, are there other ways of engagement that other work groups have been exploring?
Not really, to be quite honest. I mean, the LinkedIn group is really the only avenue right now that we're exploring, and taking that slow just to make sure that it's done properly, it's done well. We have all the mechanisms in place that we need to make sure that it's run the way that it should, and we don't run into any issues. And you know, we have a system in place to make sure that we have that people know what is and is not okay to post in the group. So we're trying to taking that slow, and that's really the only one that's other workers are really exploring right now.
Okay. Well, maybe with about 15 minutes or 12 minutes left, I'm certainly open if there are any final comments that folks have, but if not, I certainly appreciate everybody's time, but maybe I'll just give a breath in case there are any final comments, or Shamarouk, as the co-lead, any other thoughts that you want to add before we adjourn? Max, I see your hands up.
I can just ask one last question.
Sure.
You know, if we're talking about programming, looking forward 6 to 9 to 12 months, what is your expectation or SID-W's expectation about having online versus virtual events, given the way COVID is moving?
So we're still discussing internally what in-person will look like. We are, I think, trying to experiment with some in-person events in the fall. But beyond that, I can't really say much right now, just because we have to see how those go before we actually go full on one way or another. So we will make a decision probably sometime in the fall as to what direction we go, which direction we go. And we also recognize that not everyone's based in DC. And we want to make sure that we are inclusive in terms from a geographical standpoint. So we're still trying to figure out the ideal solution. Suffice to say that virtual will be involved regardless, whatever happens in the long term. So there will always be some kind of virtual programming regardless of what we decide in terms of in-person events, just because we know our audience has become more global over the last 18 plus months, but also beyond before that too. So sorry, long story short is a little bit to be determined, but you can count on something being in person during the fall, I believe, at this moment in time. We're still evaluating and figuring out the best way to do it.
Thanks for that, Paul. Other final thoughts before we adjourn?
I had a quick question. So based on today's discussion, the events that will follow, or one or more events that will follow, is there any way to contribute to the agenda or to the speaker list for the event?
Certainly. I mean, I think, you know, Shamarouk and I are kind of just a small two-person team here. And so I think, you know, what we'll probably do after gathering this input is we'll probably huddle initially and start thinking about how do we begin to translate, you know, the feedback that we've received today, kind of the inputs through the Mentimeter, into at least some ideas of some different topics. And certainly for those that are interested in maybe supporting or playing a role in helping us to plan certain events, I think we'd be open to that. But a lot of it is really just figuring out how to get panelists sourced, to really get kind of events or discussions scheduled and facilitated, and then to go from there. But I think we would certainly welcome collaboration from those on this call and beyond. Otherwise, people get bored of just hearing from me and Shamarik. So.
Sorry, I also just want to mention before I forget that, oh, sorry. Oops. Okay, hold on, sorry. Sorry about that. Just want to take this time to say too that we are recording this event and that it will be posted publicly on our YouTube channel. So just want, as a disclaimer, let all of you know that we have done that.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Again, I appreciate your dedicating some time to spend with us today to think about what topics might be of interest to this group and inform some of the thoughts we have as far as topical programming for the next 6 to 12 months. As we shared at the beginning, usually the goal is to get at least 2 to 3 programs per working group planned. We will certainly continue to stay engaged with this group to the extent as we're getting those things on the schedule, and as people are interested in contributing or playing a larger role, certainly feel free to let us know.
Yeah, thank you from my end as well. This has been super helpful as Mike and I think about future programming, and definitely stay engaged with us, connect with us on LinkedIn. And I hope that we can get the LinkedIn group also functioning soon, so we can stay more connected regularly. In the meantime, just feel free to reach out via email as well. I'll put my email here, and Mike can as well.